Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me. This is the lovely podcast, The Endurance of Labor Laws. I am your lovely host, Lesley Sullivan, and today is episode 53. We are going to take a look at the Association of Flight Attendants. But first of all, I want to give a big shout out to my listeners. So let me go to my list here. And it's quite a large list. This is awesome. So this podcast has been growing tremendously. So not only in the United States, but in other countries as well. So obviously people are hungry for this type of information. They want to know about labor laws. They want to know and understand what is going on with their labor, their wages, and kind of what to do, and have some examples of how to handle certain things. So that's really good. So a big shout out to Oklahoma, Texas, New York, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, British Columbia, Massachusetts, District of Columbia, and Oregon. And then in terms of other countries, Canada, the United Kingdom, Netherlands, Slovakia, South Africa, Japan, and Denmark. So that is wonderful there. Now we are going to talk about the Association of Flight Attendants. Now this one, I was a little disappointed. Because when you think of flight attendants, you think of super nice people that work on airlines and give you peanuts and drinks and things like that, which is technically what they're supposed to do. But this organization kind of has not been the best one. And what I mean by that is that it greatly disappointed me in terms of how they behave as an organization and as an association, because I don't think they operate in a very good and kind manner. So before we dive into that, I think it's important to go over some basic definitions of some of the words we have described or that I have used in these podcasts in times past, because I got to thinking about if someone doesn't understand the word that I'm using, like if they don't use certain words, or maybe, they haven't taken a history class on certain things, or maybe they didn't have the opportunity to learn about these things, they may not have a clue at all what I'm talking about and why I get concerned with certain things. So I'm going to go over some basic definitions here. Okay, so the basic definition of socialism is a political, social, and economic philosophy encompassing a range of economic and social systems characterized by social ownership of the means of production, meaning you don't have individual ownership. It belongs to the collective as a whole. It says here it includes the political theories and movements associated with such systems, meaning different types of socialism. So then here, another definition is a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole, meaning not you specifically. So if you own property under socialism, you wouldn't own it. Somebody else would. It would be someone who probably doesn't know you, doesn't love you, doesn't really care about you, but someone is basically just letting you kind of have that property. That's socialism, because it's like you share everything, but yet no one really owns anything. So then no one really takes ownership of anything. It's really weird. So that is the definition of socialism, and that very much describes Europe. Europeans, if they are socialist Europeans, because I've met some Europeans that they immigrated to the United States because they want capitalism, they want freedom. But Europeans that love Europe think there's nothing wrong with their countries. They very much hate the rich, they hate capitalism, and they think you don't deserve what you earn. They think it's the obligation and the right of the community and of the government to take what you have and give it to somebody else. Basically, they legalize stealing. They legalize thievery. Well, thievery is still thievery. It means that something is being taken from one person and going to another person that doesn't actually own it and didn't earn it. That's what that means. So next up is the definition of communism. Communism is a philosophical, social, political, and economic ideology and movement whose goal is the establishment of a communist society, namely a socio-economic order structured upon the ideas of common ownership, meaning nobody owns anything specifically, common ownership of the means of production, and the absence of social classes, money, and the state, meaning the government runs everything. There is no upper class, middle class, lower class. The government owns all your money. The government owns the banks. The government owns the gas stations. An example of this, just a pinch of communism in Italy. When my mom and I were in Italy several years ago in 2012, it would have been 2011, I take that back, 2011, there was a strike going on. There were several strikes. The Italian people were very angry at their government because the government controls the cost of fuel in Italy. And the government didn't think that people should be driving as much, so they punished them by raising the gas prices. However, people still have jobs and they need to get to and from work, but the government didn't care. It just thought, well, we'll just raise the prices because we know what's best for you. You don't have a brain. Your money actually belongs to us, so if we don't think you should be driving, if we don't think you should be out on the road, we're going to punish you financially. But see, here's the thing, the Italian people, they keep voting in the wrong people. It's like they never wake up. They keep having all these strikes. And it's just kind of ridiculous because it's like, how much yelling and screaming are you going to do before you actually get something done? That's what it told me when I was over there. And I was there as a tourist, but I mean, I felt sorry for the Italian people because I did notice their gas prices. I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, how can anybody afford this? Well, guess what? Most of the people in Italy cannot afford it. The poverty rate there is very high. We never hear about it. It's not hardly ever reported. They do not have very many rich people. Their middle class is dwindling. See, that's what happens when you have the government in charge of a lot of things. It just sucks your economy dry of money, and then there's lack of jobs, lack of employment. Your financial institutions are weakened. There's inflation. There was horrible inflation when we were there, and it's modern Italy. It's like Mussolini isn't here anymore. He's dead. So why are they still having problems with their economy and inflation and with socialism? Well, and a little bit of communism there, but they're still voting in bad people. Either the Italian people are stupid, which I don't think they are. I've met some really nice Italian people. Some are very smart, some are not. It's just like in any country. You've got the smart, the dumb, the in the middle, you got everybody in between. But what I don't understand about Italy is they keep voting in bad people, but yet they still keep complaining. I'm like, you know what? If you keep voting in bad people, you really have no place to complain. Because you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing at the ballot box. That's my thing. Like, I don't like it when people complain in the United States when they didn't even get out and vote. I'm like, if you don't let your voice be heard in the ballot, why should I listen to your voice now? You're not a part of society if you're not voting. I could care less how someone votes. That is their civic responsibility, and who they vote for is their business. But I cannot stand listening to people that tell me they didn't even vote and that yet they're complaining about stuff. I'm like, so you're basically just sitting on the sidelines being lazy and you're just complaining all the time when you're not doing anything about it. That doesn't mean striking or being violent. It just means go to the ballot, go to the voter box and let your voice be heard. That's a wonderful privilege that we have here in the United States, is that we can vote. And our electoral college actually does work. The United States is one of the most legitimate places to vote, as opposed to what our media will say, which they're a bunch of liars anyway. They just spin the news however they want just to get people upset, just to have more viewers, and it just racks up more money for them. So basically journalism in the United States, especially like CNN, NBC, like all these really popular news outlets, they make money off of fear. They have all these fearful stories that they basically terrorize the American people with and just put them in a frenzy, whether it's COVID, Omicron, the Delta variant, or vaccines, or the market. Like, they just scare people. Like, they hardly ever talk about anything good. Do we need to be aware of things? Yes. But the media, they make so much money based on how many people watch their channel and how many people follow them online and on their social media. Like, if everybody turned off their TV and did not watch the news, these news channels would be like, wait a second, maybe we actually need to do good journalism, stop lying about people, and stop enticing fear into everybody's life. Journalism used to be about just presenting the facts, not arguing, not lying, not spinning it, not repeating the same thing every single hour on the hour. Like, come up with something new. There's tons of stuff to report in this country. I mean, it just amazes me what all they just nitpick on. It's just like, you know what? We need some different television stations. We need some different shows. But anyway, Another example or another definition of communism is a political theory derived from Karl Marx, advocating class war and leading to a society in which all property is publicly owned and each person works and is paid according to their abilities and needs. Would you really want to live under that? That you don't actually own anything? You don't own your property, you don't own your car, you don't own your bicycle. Everything is publicly owned. What he's trying to do is he was trying to create a false utopia. But what is a lie about that is saying, and is paid according to their abilities and needs. Communism tries to make everybody equal to the extreme. Meaning they don't want people to move up, but they will definitely push people down. Communism does not want anybody to be rich except for the Communist Party. An example of this is Communist China. Now, if you are a higher up in the Communist Party in China, you've probably got it made. You're probably very wealthy. You can afford to pay people off. But if you're not a higher up in the Communist Party, or even if you're not in the Communist Party in China, you're probably a pauper. You're probably a peasant. Communist China does not really have a middle class. That's what makes America so great, is that you determine where you want to be. Not the government, not the regime. You determine that. You decide that. But under communism, you lose basically all your rights as an individual, as a person. Because you're not viewed as a person, you're just viewed as a collective. So it's kind of a lie to say, and is paid according to their abilities and needs. Well, if everything is publicly owned, why would your abilities and needs even matter? Because no one cares to acknowledge them, much less pay you appropriately for what you are quote-unquote worth. The Communist Party tried to do that in the USSR, in the Soviet Union, and it completely failed. Because they want everybody to be a peasant, to be a pauper. The only people that had money were the higher-ups in the Communist Party. They were living high off the hog. They had, the Rolls Royce, the furs, the diamonds, the jewels, all this stuff, the really nice places to live. Everybody else was forced to be poor. It was the government that decided where you worked, how you worked, where you lived, what you could say, what you couldn't say. And they were quick to throw people in jail, if not execute them, or just have you disappear. That's the communist and technically the fascist way of things. Socialism is kind of a lesser degree of communism and fascism. But it's always about suppression. Even though they claim to care about you as a whole, what about as an individual? See, basically, this takes away your individual rights on every level. That's what makes anything to do with communism and fascism very dangerous to any society. Not just the United States, but to any society. And we've seen that in the USSR, the Soviet Union, Communist Europe, Communist China. We've seen that it's really bad. And people really suffer at the hands of their leaders. And what's sad is that some people fall for these leaders and they keep voting them in. That's if they haven't rigged it. But they keep voting in these people that keep promising them, oh, we're going to give you food, water, and shelter. It's the banks that are the problem. They're the ones who are stealing from you. Actually, they're not. If they're doing something wrong, you take them to court. More than likely, they pay a fine or go to jail. But unfortunately, there are a lot of people that think that communism is the solution to everything. It's not. It's not the solution to anything. Because it strips you of your individuality and it strips you of your rights as a human being within your society. See, a society is made up of all different kinds of people. Like we come together as a society, but not as the same type of person. We come together as a collective to be ourselves, to be individuals, so that we can express our individual ideas, or individual talents, or individual needs. But under communism and fascism, you're not allowed to be who you are. You're either silenced, suppressed, or gotten rid of. That's basically your three options for that. So that is the definition of communism. Let me go to another one here. So we're going to look at what is the difference between communism versus capitalism. Okay? Okay, so what is the difference between communism and capitalism? The primary point of difference between capitalism and communism is regarding the ownership of means of production or resources in general. Communism shuns private individual ownership of land or any vital resources. On the other hand, capitalism believes in private ownership of land and means of production. That means your labor. That means your wages. Anything that you can produce or purchase. Under communism, I'll give an example of this. One of the things that came out about the USSR, the Soviet Union, when the wall fell, because it was a secret society. It was very secret. No one got in, no one got out. If you got in, it was very suspicious why you were able to get in. But when that nation fell, a lot of things came out about what they were doing. And one of the things they were doing is if you wanted to buy clothes or underwear, you were only allowed 2 sizes, small or large. That was it. And there were like only 2 or 3 sizes of bras for women. Also, you couldn't go to the store and just buy any kind of fruit that you wanted. Like, you couldn't even buy a banana because the government deemed it too expensive to import those. Like, there were so many fruits and vegetables that the people of the Soviet Union did not have access to because of communism. The higher-ups had access to all this really good food and basic nutrients, but the population of the country did not. So a lot of people starved to death, and a lot of them were malnourished and had malnutrition. And they did not have access to basic food. So the government controlled their labor, the goods, the price of things, where they lived. It prevented anything to do with making an individual decision based on what the individual wants. Capitalism is the complete opposite. Capitalism believes in private ownership of lands and means of production, meaning if you want to go buy a Slurpee or whatever it's called, an Icy from 7-Eleven, you can go to 7-Eleven and buy whatever you want. If you want a Coca-Cola one, you can buy that. If you want Mountain Dew, you can buy that. If you want to buy a small piece of land, you can go buy a small piece of land. If you want to buy a mansion, you can go buy a mansion. And everything in between. But under communism, you're not allowed free will whatsoever. Most of the time, their people lived in terror. They were malnourished. They were treated horribly. They were basically enslaved. And the government decided where and when you worked. Under capitalism, you as the individual decide when and where you work. Because you know what you want. Under communism, the government says it knows what it wants for everybody, so you should just do what we say. You have no brain. We're in charge. You're not. That's why the USSR fell. It was in power for way too long. I mean, that kind of power should have never been tolerated, but there were a lot of bad decisions that were made at the end of World War II. Because, see, here's the thing. If you haven't read about the Red Army, and that's what their army was called from the Soviet Union, you need to read about them. Because I saw a documentary, and there was this one woman, she's a Jewish woman, she was a young 20-something-year-old Jewish woman. They were liberated somewhere over there in the Soviet bloc or whatever. And she said the Nazis were nothing compared to the Red Army, what they did to people. It was horrible. It was graphic. It was grotesque. It was frightening to her. And all those Jewish people that were stuck there. The Soviet Union had no intention of giving back property that belonged to the Jews. They had no intention. I'm not talking about Israel and the Holy Land and all that stuff. I'm talking about private property that these Jews owned before they were enslaved in these prison camps and or killed, like at Auschwitz or something. So when their families went back to try and get their private property because they actually did own it, the Soviet Union didn't give them back their property. So they were forced to live elsewhere based on kind of a military thinking on how the Red Army viewed them, which was pretty horrible. And it was just a horrible way of life. But I've never forgotten that. Like when we think of horrible militaries, we just think of the Nazis. But when I heard what this woman said, she said the Nazis were nothing compared to what the Red Army did over in the Soviet Union. That is scary. And they practiced communism. The Nazis were bad enough being fascist and practicing genocide. But see, here's the thing. There was massive genocide after World War II in the Soviet Union. If you didn't do what the government wanted, they killed you. They got rid of you. Or they threatened your family. Like if you were a man over in the Soviet Union and you were married, if you spoke out about something against the government, they said, you speak out like that again, we're going to kill your wife and maybe slaughter your children. So do you care more about your so-called country or do you care more about your kids and your wife? That's how they silenced people all those years. Like that's how evil the Red Army was. And it was a good thing communism came to an end in the Soviet Union and eventually became Russia. Like current day Russia, people may have this horrible opinion of Russia, but they are not as bad or evil as what the Soviet Union was. Not at all. It is completely different. Do I like everything they do? No, of course not. But if you have to compare, they are way kinder now to humanity than they were back then. Because they're not communist or fascist. So, that's the difference between those two right there. There was another one that I wanted to pull up and look here. It says, okay, so the difference between communism versus socialism, alright? It says the main difference is that under communism, most property and economic resources are owned and controlled by the state, rather than individual citizens. Under socialism, all citizens share equally in economic resources as allocated by a democratically selected government. So you're still not free. So in terms of tyranny, socialism is the least tyrannical, I would say. The least one that's going to cause some tyranny. It's still tyranny compared to what we know in the United States and what we have, which we have a republic and a democracy and capitalism. We are the complete opposite of all of these. Because we were founded on freedom. We were not founded on controlling people like they're drones. So you have communism, fascism, and socialism. Socialism has become popular because it's kind of like, well, if you're educated, then you would be for socialism. If you were cool, you'd be for socialism. You know, if you were against greed, you would be for socialism. No, you would not. Because every single one of these, communism, fascism, and socialism, they all practice greed. Why? Because no one owns anything. Someone else is always taking from you. You own nothing. Property ownership is not true or valid under these three types of governments. The only way you can own property and have ownership and true freedom is under democracy and technically under republic and under, I guess you could say, a free market and capitalism. Because it's only under those circumstances that the individual has the opportunity to choose whether or not they want to own property. See, under these other three, communism, fascism, and socialism, you don't even have a choice on what you want to own or what you can own. That choice is taken away from you. And it's always taken away by whoever you put in charge. And that's your government. So that's why it's so important to vote. And to mean it when you vote. And to vote for the right thing. Vote for freedom. You know, I say this, even if you don't like Republicans, please still vote for them because they're one of the few people that actually believes in freedom. Sometimes Democrats do not. They want to put all their eggs in one basket and they want to put the government in charge of that basket. I cannot think of a single time in history at all, and I know my history pretty well, I cannot think of a single example where the government was put in charge of everything and the citizens were completely happy and they got everything they wanted and they could express themselves freely, they could practice their religion, they made really good money, they could own their house, they could move wherever they wanted to. Because see, here's the thing, when you put someone else in charge of you and control over you, you lose all freedom. An example of this is prison. If you commit a crime and you go to prison, you lose all your freedom. You can't go anywhere that you want. You can't buy anything that you want. You can't purchase or sell property. There's so many things you can't do. Well, here's the thing. These types of governments, communism, fascism, and socialism, they operate the same way. They take and take and take and take and take and take and take away from the individual. Because they don't think the individual is qualified to do anything on their own. It's like a nanny state. Well, see, here's the thing. Once you reach the age of 18, you are an adult. But under those three types of government, they don't care what age you are. They don't view you as an adult. They don't think you're qualified to do really anything. They don't think you're qualified to have a good life. They don't think you're qualified to practice your religion. They don't think you're qualified to be wealthy. They don't think you should have access to good health care. So all three of these have horrible health care. And they claim it's free when it's not. It's limited. Because do you really think the government wants to spend a lot of money on you if you have cancer and you need a very expensive cancer drug? Do you really think they're going to want to spend that money on you? No, they're not. Why? Because they don't care about the individual. They're looking at society as a whole. And as a whole, they don't want problems. So how do they eliminate problems, quote unquote problems? They let people die off naturally. They restrict their health care, they limit medicine, and they just hope and pray that you die at home. They weed out the weak. Instead of curing people and treating people, they basically just get rid of them, one way or the other. Under communism and fascism, they might very well kill you. Under socialism, they just make these promises that, hey, it's free medicine, and oh, you got to be put on a waiting list. Oh, we're looking into it. Oh, we're going to get you into a specialist. It's going to be about 5 or 6 years. And if you're alive, if you're still alive, then that's great. You can see whoever you want. Well, who's to say you're going to live that long without treatment? But under capitalism and under democracy, you can go see a doctor within less than 48 hours if you need to go see a specialist, because you as the individual are in charge of your health care. You as the individual are in charge of your life, nobody else. You still have rules, laws, and regulations in your country under capitalism and democracy, but it's the people that are in charge. Not these government agencies, not these dictators. It's the people. Because it's the people that know what they want. Why? Because they are an individual and they know what they want and need in their personal life. See, under these three types of government, you don't have a personal life. Just take a look at what was going on in the USSR with the KGB, the USSR, excuse me, under the KGB. They had officers following and stalking so many of their citizens, and they kept tabs on them, and nobody knew this until they raided the KGB office, and there were all these notes on people's everyday, daily lives, where they went, what they did, how much money they spent. Because the government, under that regime, practiced intrusion. They gave themselves permission to be intrusive into people's private lives. See, under communism, fascism, or socialism, you don't have privacy because you don't have freedom. Everything is controlled by somebody else. And it is whoever you put in power. So if you're going to put someone in power, put someone that believes in freedom. Not control, freedom. Otherwise, you're basically going to get screwed. You will lose your property. You will lose your money. banks will fail, there will be inflation, there will be shortages of food, the military will become very militant, it will be a daily interaction, most likely they will not be nice. That's what happened in the USSR. That's why the Red Army was so evil. They did evil things to their fellow citizens as a form of manipulation and control. That's how they were able to control such a large landmass like Russia. It was fear. They weren't free. They hated it. When that wall fell down, people couldn't wait to get out of there, and they couldn't wait to see their family members that were just on the other side of the wall. But they were not even allowed to communicate with their family members that were on the other side until that wall fell. See, these types of governments, they don't care about families. They don't want you to rely on your family. They don't want you to think that you have someone there for you except the government. They want you to think the government is your source. And that the government is more important than your family. Because these governments, they know that if they can brainwash you and make you dependent upon them, then you're not going to care as much about what happens to your family, and you might even turn on them and turn them in on something. See, these three types of government, they are regimes. They're not about freedom. They're not about democracy. They're not about doing the right thing. They don't value human life. In fact, almost every country that practices communism or fascism, statistically, they have some of the highest rates of inhumane practices in their society and in their culture. They are mostly human rights violators. So being that we know that, why would we want to follow anything that resembles any of these? It's very dangerous to do that. I'm going to get a drink of water. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. So that being said, about those three different types of government, and that they are regimes, I'm noticing that a lot of these associations and labor unions are founded in very much a fascist or communist manner, and sometimes it's because they have fascist or communist members that actually start these labor unions. That's why so many times with these red flags are going up in my head, because I see the warning signs of this and how they act. Now, in regards to the Association of Flight Attendants, I was very disappointed because there's a part of them that act very militant. And they don't care who they hurt, especially financially, and they don't care who they have to hire to be a bully. And we're going to see that here. So let's go ahead and start on this one. This is the Association of Flight Attendants. It was founded August 22nd, 1945. They are headquartered in Washington, D.C. They have one location in the United States. They have 45,377 members. Sarah Nelson is the international president. Deborah Suter is the international vice president. And Kevin Grahan is the international secretary-treasurer. They have affiliations with the AFL-CIO, CWA, and ITF. It says here the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA, commonly known as AFA, is a union representing flight attendants in the United States. As of January 2018, AFA represents 50,000 flight attendants in 20 airlines. Since 2004, AFA has been part of the Communications Workers of America, CWA, an affiliate of AFL-CIO. AFA is also an affiliate of the International Transport Workers Federation. AFA was founded in 1945 by flight attendants at United Airlines. The organization was originally known as Airline Stewardess Association, ALSA. ALSA negotiated its first contract with United in 1946. In 1949, ALSA merged with the Airline Stewards and Stewardesses Association, ALSSA, an affiliate of the Airline Pilots Association, ALPA. By 1951, ALSSA had 3,300 members. ALPA created two separate divisions in 1960, one for pilots and one for stewards and stewardesses. Nearly half of the USA's 8,700 flight attendants were members of ALPA's S&S division at that time. In 1973, ALSSA flight attendants chose self-determination and formed an independent Association of Flight Attendants, leaving ALPA. In 1982, AFA had 22,000 members at 18 American airlines. In 1984, the AFL-CIO granted AFA a charter. In July 2006, Northwest Airlines flight attendants voted to replace their independent union with AFA. AFA's membership rose to 55,000 flight attendants. On November 4th, 2010, AFA was decertified by the National Mediation Board as the bargaining representative for the pre-merger Northwest Airlines flight attendants of Delta Airlines after narrowly losing a representational election of the combined group the day before. AFA filed objections to the election with the National Mediation Board alleging interference. That wouldn't surprise me at all. A lot of these unions are corrupt and crooked, especially when it comes to voting, contracts, and money. We've seen that in times before, so it doesn't surprise me at all with this. On June 29, 2011, AFA won one of the largest private sector union elections in decades, winning representation rights for the combined workforce of approximately 24,000 flight attendants at United Airlines, Continental Airlines, and Continental Micronesia. That election was triggered by a National Mediation Board ruling that those airlines had formed a single transportation system as a result of a corporate merger. CHOAS, CHOAS, is AFA's trademark strategy of intermittent strikes designed to maximize the impact of an industrial action while minimizing the risk for striking flight attendants. Basically, they created a bully. And we're going to see how this panned out, and it wasn't very good, at least for the people they bullied. In May 1993, AFA members at Seattle-based Alaska Airlines were facing a 30-day cooling-off period after more than 3 years of negotiations. Now, what that tells me is that neither party knows how to negotiate. Your negotiations should never take 3 years. Maybe max should be like 2 or 3 months. But 3 years of this? That's backbiting. It's ridiculous. Like, they can't come to a happy medium or a happy conclusion. And it should be happy, because when you're doing business with people, you should always want what's best for the other person. But I can tell that these negotiations and these contracts are very one-sided. And it's almost always at the fault of the union. In June 1993, the cooling-off period mandated by the Railway Labor Act had expired. The first chaos strike took place in Seattle when 3 flight attendants walked off an Alaska Airlines flight just before passenger boarding. Now, here's the thing. I know, and I don't know the exact number, but I do know that in order for an airline to take off, they have to have a minimum number of employees on that airline, otherwise they can't take off. These flight attendants knew that. And they totally cheated these people out of their money, these passengers, because passengers paid for a ticket so they could get to their destination, but these flight attendants, through a hissy fit, basically took the money and ran, is what happened here. Passengers paid for a flight, and the flight attendant said, hey, we don't like what's going on with our labor, with our wages, with our pension plans, whatever the case may be, and they just walked off the job, leaving all those passengers stranded at the airport. Now, is that the right thing to do? No. They put their needs above everybody else's needs. That is very selfish, and that is greed. That's why some of these labor unions are so wrong in what they do and how they handle stuff, because it can impact the public directly. And that's why a lot of these labor unions, they have too much power. And it's really sad, because all they really do is just punish other people that are not in their union. And that's really pathetic that that's the only way they can get their way, is to cry wolf all the time, make it seem like they're the victim, when they are not the victim. They are actually part of the problem. Goes on to say a month later, another crew of flight attendants struck the last flight out of Las Vegas. So basically those passengers were stuck in Las Vegas for another night. You know, some people really do want to leave Vegas, but they were stuck there. A few weeks later, AFA struck 5 flights simultaneously in the San Francisco area. So if you wanted to leave San Francisco, sorry, you were stuck there. You can thank the flight attendant that's collecting a wage but not doing their job. America West, AirTran, and U.S. Airways all settled with AFA on the eve of or a few minutes after the end of a 30-day cooling off period in the 1990s. So basically, because AFA formed this tyrannical bully group called Chaos, these 3 different employers caved in to their demands. I would have said fight them. Don't give in to that. Fire the people that are causing the problem and hire people that are not going to cause a problem. See, because here's the thing. With unions, especially with this one, they're acting like it's their name on the side of the plane. They act like it's their name on the side of the building. When it's not. Their name is not on the corporate office building. They're a flight attendant. They're paid to serve the passengers. They're not the CEO. They're not the CFO. Like, they really think too much of themselves. And they're putting their wages and their wants and desires over the safety of the plane and the passengers. To me, that's grounds for termination. Because the number one thing that is important for flight attendants is safety. I would think OSHA would prove that. But safety of the airline and safety of the passengers. Their wages and their pension funds come second, third, fourth, or fifth. It's on down the line because when you work in customer service, and especially when you work in an industry where safety is really important, your wages should not be the first thing on your mind when you are at the job on an airline. It should be the safety of the passengers and the safety of your fellow crewmen on that airline. But that just shows you the arrogance and the unprofessionalism of this association. They care more about themselves than the safety and the efficacy of running an airline. Or not running, operating an airline. That is very concerning. See, that's where unions get off track. They make it all about them and not the people they are supposed to be helping, the people that they're doing business with. They want the money and the cushy job and the cushy benefits, but when it comes down to it, they don't really care to do the work. They squeal about it. And they get away with it because that's what unions do. They help people get overpaid. Well, guess what? That causes inflation within the industry and within the economy. And we'll see that later on. It says AFA flight attendants at Midwest Express, now Midwest Airlines, complete a cooling off period without reaching agreement on a first contract in 2002. After 3 weeks of a chaos campaign, basically the professionally paid bullies. After 3 weeks of a chaos campaign and on the eve of chaos strikes, management agreed to terms that were ratified by the flight attendants. United Airlines flight attendants used the threat of chaos to leverage their negotiations during the airline's bankruptcy, succeeding in doubling the value of the replacement retirement plan management had proposed. See, it's about money. It's about greed. See, when people think of greed, they think of Wall Street. Greed is not just in Wall Street. It's in pockets all over the world. But it is especially prevalent and present in labor unions. Greed is everywhere in labor unions, trade unions, and associations like this. Because it's all about self-preservation. It's not about what's doing what's right. And that's what's really sad. Really sad. And also, this shows their incompetence and their unprofessionalism because they don't even care that this company is having to go through bankruptcy. They still want their retirement plan. Guess what? If the company you work for is going bankrupt, nobody's going to have retirement. You may not even have a job. But these flight attendants that are part of this group, they're so selfish, so greedy, so unrealistic, they're going to suck this company dry of its monies for all it's worth. Because they think they're more important than other people when they're not. See, that's not equality, that's favoritism. And when you have a free market and a fair market, you don't have favoritism. You have competition. And also you have equality. But they don't want competition because they want to control the prices. And they don't want to be shown up that they're not doing a good job on their job while they're punching the clock. They don't want to have to be held accountable to good standards. They would rather stay at subpar standards but get paid really well. They basically want to make a lot of money for not doing a good job. They're lazy, ungrateful, unprofessional people. And that sounds harsh, but think about it. They value money more than they do the safety of an airline, than the safety of the passengers. If that's not cruel, I don't know what is. This was very eye-opening to read about this. Also, this shows that these flight attendants, they don't understand bankruptcy. They don't understand bankruptcy laws. They don't understand legislation regarding that. They don't understand profit and loss ratios. They don't understand accounts payable, receivable. They don't understand accounting. They don't understand human resources. They don't understand inflation within the economy. They don't understand basic business practices. Like if they actually had to own their own business, they would not behave like this. If they were the CEO of this company, they would not want anyone to treat them the way that they are treating the current CEO of these companies. But because they're quote unquote the workers, they can cry wolf and pretend to be the victim when they in fact are the wolves. They may not be the wolves on Wall Street, but they are the wolves in these airlines. Because they know the game. You throw a hissy fit long enough, you just might get a really good contract. And all they have to do is walk off the plane and then not show up to work. So obviously they must not really care about payroll expenses. Because they must not really care about getting paid or not. Because if someone just walks off the job, that tells me they don't really want a paycheck. And if they do want a paycheck and they just walked off the job, they want to get paid for not doing anything. Well, that's greed. That's stealing. But if you call them out on it, it's how can you say that to someone that's in a union? How can you say that? Look at the work that they do. Really, what work? If they walk off the airline, off the jet, and don't show up to work, they're not doing the work. And all those passengers are stranded until they can find someone to help load the jet. Like, they just don't understand how businesses operate. They don't own a company, they don't operate the company, but yet they act like it's their name on the side of the building, and they act like it's their name on each one of those jets. When it's not. Because if they owned it, they wouldn't act like that. If they actually owned a business, they would never act in an unprofessional manner. Never. Not like this. But you see, they think that their labor is more important than everybody else's. So they raise themselves up just so they can push other people down. And then when they can't push down, the CEO or the company the way they want, they can't push them around like they want, they hire a bully group to do the intimidation. How is that right? That's just completely unethical in every way, shape, or form, and it's sad. It's like, wow, they literally don't understand how the private sector works. But they know how to act dirty. It reminds me of a dirty cop. That's what it reminds me of. And that's not a pleasant thought, and it's not a compliment to be called that. So maybe they should wake up to their behavior. Goes on to say, flight attendants at Northwest Airlines, locked in a round of bankruptcy negotiations, deployed a chaos campaign days after joining AFA in July 2006. So basically, they hired again the bully. Union negotiators concluded a new tentative agreement with millions of dollars in improvements, but which was voted down by a narrow margin. AFA continued preparations for chaos strikes at Northwest pending the outcome of negotiations and litigation surrounding the case. So basically, regardless of whether they get their way or not, they're still going to strike. They still have that bully card in their back pocket. The bankruptcy court ruled in favor of the union, denying the strike injunction sought by management. On appeal, the Federal District Court and the Court of Appeals ruled that workers under the Railway Labor Act cannot strike in response to rejection of a collective bargaining agreement in bankruptcy. Northwest and AFA returned to negotiations and reached a new tentative agreement, which was narrowly ratified by the flight attendants on May 29, 2007. The flight attendants became the last major work group at Northwest to agree to new contract terms in bankruptcy. The new contract provided Northwest with $195 million in annual cuts through 2011 and secured a $182 million equity claim for the flight attendants before it was lost upon the company's exit from bankruptcy. So here we have flight attendants that they want a piece of the pie. Because we're talking millions of dollars when we're talking about airlines here. They want a piece of the pie. Well, here's the thing. They didn't purchase the ingredients. They didn't bake it, much less cook the pie. But yet, they want a bigger piece of it. That is selfishness and greed. And it comes from their union. Because unions know how to find out information on employers and figure out, okay, how much money are they making? We deserve that money. They don't deserve it. They're rich. Really. So if you're against rich people, why are you trying to get their money? Like, if you get their money and you become rich, aren't you the very person that you said was evil and bad? See, that's the hypocrisy of that. See, that's the hypocrisy of fascism, communism, and socialism. It claims that wealthy people are bad, but yet they still want their money. So they can have money. Well, if money is bad, why would you want their money? If being wealthy is quote-unquote wrong and evil, why would you want to be wealthy? Why take what someone else has just so you can have it? That's greed, and that's thievery. It's wrong. But unfortunately, with these labor unions, they give themselves permission to legally steal. And they do it by infiltrating legislation within these different states and within the federal government. So they are manipulating our rules, laws, and regulations on a state level and a federal level. That's why it's important to know your labor laws. So that way you know when someone's trying to manipulate it specifically for themselves, thereby creating inequality all across the board. Because whenever someone raises their rights above someone else's, it immediately creates injustice. It immediately creates inequality. It immediately creates favoritism and sometimes nepotism. None of which is appropriate for the workforce, much less the United States or any country. But I mean, Europe practices favoritism all the time, even though they claim to practice inclusivism. It's such a lie. They have favoritism all the time. And they put down the United States for practicing capitalism. Capitalism is the direct opposite of favoritism. Capitalism is where you can succeed regardless of your circumstances. But if you're in a socialist country or communist or fascist country, you can't hardly succeed at all because someone's always there to push you down. Why? Because they want what you want. And they don't think you deserve it. That's jealousy, greed, and favoritism. It's favoritism because they put certain people in charge to pick and choose who should be successful and who should not. That's what unions like this are doing. That's what associations like this are doing. They're deciding which airlines deserve to make money and which ones should be sucked dry of their assets. That is very sad that they do that. And that they created their own little militant striking group to bully people. I'll tell you what, if I was the CEO of any of these airlines, if ever anyone tried to pull a chaos strike on my company, I'd be like, you're fired. Every single one of you. And I'll keep firing you, whoever you put in here, until we get some good, normal people that don't pull that crap, excuse my language, that don't pull that horse manure on a job. It's not appropriate. It's like you either want to do the work or you don't. If you don't like your wages, go get a different job. If you don't like the work environment, go get a different job. See, as an employer, If I was an owner of one of these airlines, I would be very concerned that they did not care about the safety of the plane. Because if they're more concerned about themselves, they're not paying attention to what they have been trained to care about, which is the safety of the passengers and the safety of the plane. Because if the plane isn't safe, no one is safe on that plane. Like, they need to get their mind right. They need to get their goals and expectations in order. Because at this point, it doesn't really sound like it is in order. It doesn't really sound like they care. Their favorite note on the piano is me, 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 me. Well, you know what? That note and that tone and that song gets very old very quickly. Because nobody likes to be around selfish, ungrateful, lazy people. Because they're almost always unprofessional. Nothing's ever good enough. And we see that here with these strikes. Like, they'll strike, but this is very similar to other unions. They'll strike, and then once the employer caves in, they strike again over somebody else. So it's like, the employer's like, okay, I'll give in, I'll give you what you want. Well, guess what? Now they're going to throw a fit about something else because now they know that you're weak. So if you are an employer listening to this and you're having to deal with a union, do not give in. Do not give in. I would go to a temp agency and say, hey, hire me some people that are not in labor unions. I need good, honest, kind people that just want to show up, do the job, do it well. If they want to get promoted, that's great, but they need to show up to work. Like, me personally, I would be so sick and tired of the backbiting. Because my thinking would be, we have a job to do. So, let's get it done. Like, it's one thing to complain about safety, about stagnation of wages and things like that, but this other stuff, it's just totally unrealistic expectations. And I have no doubt that they're trying to continuously fight for these cushy pension plans and retirement funds and things like that. See, here's the danger of that. We have a lot of people that are retiring all at the same time in this country because we have a lot of baby boomers. But see, here's the thing. We don't have enough people entering the workforce to make up the difference, the cost difference. See, because here's the thing. A lot of people don't understand that whenever people retire and they get these pension benefits, they're not being paid the monies that they paid in. They're being paid monies that are being currently paid in by the new employees and the current employees. See, it's really just a lie. Just like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Oh, I paid in, so I should get my fair share. Well, I got news for you. That money was spent the moment it was drafted out of your check, so it's never really been there. It's a failed, broken, financial strain of a system. And we've seen that in the automaker industry. We've seen that in USPS. We've seen that with the Hostess brand. We've seen that in a lot of different places. Because too many people are taking retirement all at the same time, and then the company doesn't have enough money in the bank to pay all these benefits. Because it's always in the hole by having to pay all these pension plans that they made promises on that it wasn't really realistic or feasible. See, that's the stupidity of some of these companies. They give in to these unions, they give in to these demands, and then they don't realize that there is an immediate consequence, but also there is a consequence long term, like 30, 40 years down the road when these people start to retire. That's especially what happened in USPS in the automaker industry, where people were made stupid promises that they could still collect 90 to 95% of their gross annual income even after they are retired and they're not working. So basically, they're almost collecting an entire paycheck every year, and they're not even working. They're not putting in any labor. Well, guess where that money comes from? It comes from the young people that are working. So if you are a young person working, realize that socialism is not the answer, because it's always spending someone else's money, particularly your money, and it's going to people that are no longer working. See, back in the day, you didn't get to retire unless you could afford to retire. This whole notion of I'm going to retire at 65 and that's just how it should be for everybody, that is such a lie. It's a great goal, don't get me wrong. But to think that everybody should retire at 65 and everybody should have cushy benefits that they don't have to pay for, BS, excuse my language, that is so wrong. Like, people when they retire, they should have been putting away their own money into retirement. They should be expecting other people to pay them once they're no longer working. That's ridiculous. It's not sustainable. That's why a lot of these companies are going bankrupt or they're failing or have closed or they're on the verge of bankruptcies because they have way too many people that are retiring because of the baby boomer generation. Now, mind you, people can't control when they were born. I'm not saying that. It's just we have way more people, population-wise, that were born during the baby boomer years, and then they didn't have as many kids as their parents. So we don't have as many people in the workforce that are able to take over this financial strain of paying these benefits. That's the problem. Because money is money. So basically, when it comes to these pension funds and these retirement plans, we have more money going out than coming in. So then usually what happens is they put basically the young people on the hook for way more than what other people have had to pay in. So basically young people are not getting as much of a paycheck as their parents did when they were younger because there are way more people that are at retirement age than are in the working stage of life. Now that's not right. I'm all for people retiring, having a good life, but if you have to live off of someone else's blood, sweat, and tears, then you got a problem. You need to be financially responsible for yourself. Stop expecting young people to fill up your bank account or buy you a boat or buy you a house. It is no one else's responsibility to pay for your stuff or to pay your income or to pay your mortgage. You are responsible for that. And I'm not against the young or the old or anybody in between. To me, it's about equality. You get what you pay for. Now, there might be some people listening that said, hey, I retired and I paid into that system. I just want to say, really? You paid into a system that more than likely you knew was going to fail because it's not sustainable, but yet you didn't take the time to investigate how to strengthen your financial portfolio and invest in other things in your retirement. So you're just completely and solely relying on something that was a broken system to begin with. Like, think about that. I'm 38 and I know that. I've known that for years, like since I was a teenager. Not because someone taught me or told me, but because I figured out. I figured out that a lot of this financial strain in our country is due to different forms of communism, fascism, and socialism. Basically, depending on someone else's paycheck. Well, if all you had to rely on was your own paycheck, then guess what? You probably would have worked harder. You probably would have invested more. You probably would have been more careful with your money. But you see, a lot of these people that rely too much on these pension plans, they rely on it just like people rely on Social Security. Social Security is not meant to equal your wages. That's not its purpose. It still gets taxed. But Social Security, it's a drop in the bucket compared to probably what you were used to making. Because it was never meant to replace your entire income. I mean, just think about the name, Social Security. Think about that. What have we talked about with those three words? Communism, fascism, and socialism. Basically, you lose the right as an individual and you're viewed as a collective in a social structure. So nobody owns anything and you basically get less. That is Social Security. Let's say you're making $95,000 a year and then you retired and then you're supposed to get Social Security. Do you really think you're going to get $95,000 a year as your Social Security? No. You're not. Do you really think the government thinks you're worth that much? No, they don't. The government just like taking money out of your check. That's what they like doing. Nobody likes to say it, but it's true. See, we're not supposed to rely on social programs because guess what? They're failed. They're doomed. Because you're always living in the past tense. You're always living off of somebody else instead of being financially and fiscally responsible for yourself. And you're probably going to say, well, Lesley, what about the elderly? What about the disabled? What about this? What about that? Well, guess what? People that are really in dire need are few and far between. And if we had more financially and fiscally responsible people, and if we had lower taxes in this country, we would actually have more money to help the people that actually need help. But unfortunately, what social welfare programs do, they're like, oh, nobody should be responsible for themselves. We'll take care of you, the government. Well, guess what? That means you're going to get a lousy check, just peanuts, just like the disabled, just like the elderly, and just like our veterans. Because the government has never really taken good care of our elderly, our disabled, and our veterans. They give them peanuts. So if that's how they treat the most vulnerable, how do you think they're going to treat you? Probably not much better. Because that's the socialized way of viewing your citizens, I guess. That's socialism. Nobody moves up, but you can definitely move down. So if you think that by voting in people that are fascists, communists, crazy liberals, or they're socialists, whatever the case may be, if you think that they really care about you, you are completely wrong. And you really need to wake up. If you think that they care about you, you need to read the history about Mussolini. You need to read about Karl Marx. You need to read about Lenin. You need to read about Stalin. Because every single one of those leaders and many others, they make these promises to people. Shame and blame the rich, steal from them, because we care about you. Well, if someone is willing to commit that kind of crime against a whole lot of people, what makes you think they're not going to turn on you? If they're willing to do something wrong to somebody else, what makes you think they won't do something wrong to you? It's the same principle. That's why a lot of these unions, they don't understand the private sector. It's like they're trying to function in a public sector mentality, but they're operating in the private sector. They don't want competition and they don't want accountability, but they want the money. What it reminds me of is Greece. Greece is notorious, their workforce is notorious for being lazy. And if there are any Greeks listening, you know it's true. You know it's true. Don't hide it, don't deny it. It's true. We all know it. Greece is notorious for wanting to get paid full-time hours but work part-time. And that's why their country is constantly bankrupt. If it wasn't for tourism and hospitality, and if it wasn't for the EU and the euro keeping them afloat, they wouldn't really be a country anymore. But they have this entitlement mentality. They don't really believe in democracy. They don't really believe in capitalism. They don't really believe in freedom. They overly tax their people, so then there's really no incentive to be successful because they know their government's just going to overtax them and take their money and give to people that don't want to work and refuse to work. I feel sorry for the European Union in a way because they've got countries like Greece, Portugal, and Spain, and Belgium They're just sucking it dry. Because many of their people don't care to work. They just want to live high off the hog. They're okay with being middle class or lower class as long as they don't have to work, but they always blame the rich for their misfortunes. And I'm like, okay, you have to be responsible for yourself. You can't just blame everybody else for your problem. Like, that goes for the same for the United States. Like, you can't blame Wall Street for every little thing. Wall Street actually provides a lot of jobs. And it creates a lot of revenue because of those jobs. And those jobs are equal to people, meaning like someone works there and then they are able to provide for their families. But if you were to have the mentality of a socialist, fascist, or communist, you would think that nobody in Wall Street has the right to make a lot of money. When it's not a right to make a lot of money, it's an opportunity to make money. That's the thing. In capitalism, in a free market, in a democracy, you don't have a right to make millions of dollars. It's my right, so I should have it. That's greed. No, you have the opportunity to make that kind of money. It's up to you. It's up to you whether or not you want to take that opportunity and make money. Make millions. Work hard. And if anything, I would say work smarter, not harder. And that is so true because the last thing you want to do is fatigue yourself. But anyway, that is it for this podcast. But I did want to talk about the differences between fascism, socialism, and communism, because a lot of these associations and labor unions, trade unions, are founded in that mentality, and that's why they have problems. And that's why they're kind of militant in how they treat people and other organizations. They even turn on each other. I mean, we've seen that with, what was the union? There's so many of them that they had jurisdictional battles. And they would try and sabotage each other's work to try and get the same job. It's like, wow, so that tells me they don't really care about labor laws and they don't really care about another worker's rights. They'd rather sabotage their work so they can steal their contract. Gee, again, that's thievery. And if we know that thievery is wrong, we're not supposed to do it. We're not supposed to behave that way. That's why these unions have problems. They give themselves permission to do unethical and unprofessional things. So that's why you have to be careful who you associate with. Big time on that. So the next one we will take a look at is the Industrial Division, CWA. We might have already done that one. So we'll either do that one or the National Association of Broadcast Employees and Technicians. So until next time, I pray that you're happy, healthy, and whole, that you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.